Good evening, everyone. I'm Kara Carmack, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Spring 2024 Evening Lecture Series. We're delighted to be joined this evening by Sasha Davis, the Executive Director of the Renee Chaim Gross Foundation, which is just a few blocks away from here on LaGuardia Place here in Greenwich Village. A reminder to those in person on 8th Street to please silence all cell phones during tonight's event. We'll reserve time at the end for Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. For our Zoom audience, you can submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the clay room for light refreshments and to continue the conversation. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 2023-24 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. Please visit our website to learn more or to make a donation to help keep programs like our Evening Lecture Series free. Now I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening. Sasha Davis is Executive Director of the Renee Chaim Gross Foundation, the historic home and studio of American sculptor Chaim Gross and his wife Renee. Davis previously held internships at MoMA PS1, and the Newark Museum. She received a BA from New York University in art history with a minor in studio art, and a certificate in arts administration and collections management, also from NYU. Now please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Sasha.
Thank you so much, Kara, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be speaking here at the New York Studio School. I'm a longtime fan of the Evening Lecture Series. So I'd like to start showing you the facade of the foundation, which is located at 526 LaGuardia Place. So this is the place where Chaim Gross lived and worked for nearly 30 years. If you haven't yet visited, please consider this an invitation. We'd love to have you to come to see the studio, home, and art collections. The title of my talk today, The Idea and the Block, is borrowed from a chapter title in Gross's 1957 book, The Technique of Wood Sculpture. I liked that it encapsulated the idea of direct carving, where you're not making preparatory models, instead you're moving directly from a drawing on paper, usually a two-dimensional drawing, and then working directly with the wood or also sometimes stone. It's much more immediate than a process like casting in bronze. And so the idea, which is the concept that you have in your mind, and then the block is the material. So bringing the idea into the physical world, which is a concern and a question every artist must face as they're working. Gross favored drawing as his preparatory step, but then he was working with a natural material, usually a block of wood. So it's a bit of a gamble because it's a natural material. It sometimes will have flaws, but then it also has the possibility of a lot of beauty and variety. This chapter includes information on how to study the block of wood, how to understand it, and then how to create a sketch in both 2 and 3 dimensions. So I hope that the mention of this book kind of makes you understand that Chaim had a very strong focus on education. He taught for the entirety of his career and was mostly a teacher at the Educational Alliance Art School on the Lower East Side. And this is a photo taken by Marion Palfy of him teaching there. So this dedication to knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge really suffused all of his choices, including the decision by he and his wife Renee to establish an educational nonprofit organization. He is best known for his direct carvings in wood, but he also used bronze, stone, and made thousands of watercolors, drawings, and prints. However, today I'm going to be focused mostly on the wood. So I don't want to dwell too much on the biography, other than to explain a little bit about Chaim's life and how it influenced his work and also his place within art history. He was born in 1902 in what was a very small town called Volova, which was near to a larger place called Kolomea. So this was in the Carpathian Mountains, in an area known as Galicia. Once Austro-Hungary at that point, but now that area is Ukraine. So his family was Jewish. He was the youngest of 5. And this 1918 photo shows him with 3 of his siblings. His eldest brother, Naftali, had already immigrated to the United States a few years earlier. Gross's father was a timber appraiser, so little Chaim Gross spent a lot of time in the woods, with the wood, and so that kind of informs a little bit about why it was so natural for him to work in wood. So unfortunately, World War I was very devastating for this area and specifically Gross's family. He was a young teen when the war broke out, and he was separated from his family and pressed into service. Very traumatic, and he eventually was able to escape, returning to Kolomea, where his family had moved by the end of the war. Following that, in 1918, he and his brother Abraham went to Budapest. His brother Pinchas, who's shown in this photo on the left, was a goldsmith. So he was studying with Pinchas how to be a goldsmith, and then also drawing on napkins in his spare time. And these drawings that he did on the back of napkins actually won him a place in the local art school, which was led by the painter Bela Utz. And unfortunately, right after he commenced his studies, there was a political regime change, which caused him to be ousted from the country along with all of the other Jewish students. So then he started studying in Vienna at the Kunstgewerbeschule. And then I want to mention, so Chaim is the one on the right in this photo, and in the middle we have his brother Abraham. So Gross was very active drawing throughout his time studying art. These both were done in 1920. And on the left, we have the old Jewish cemetery in Kolomea. So that's, that larger town that his family had moved to. And then on the right is a view of Budapest. So these were some of the only possessions that Gross brought with him when he immigrated to the United States. The only thing he had was a small portfolio of drawings. So he and his brother Abraham immigrated in 1921, landing at Ellis Island, and then also they were assisted in finding their brother Naftali in the Lower East Side by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And really immediately, he already had come to the US knowing he wanted to be an artist, so he started taking classes at the Educational Alliance Art School, which was part of a larger organization that was a Jewish settlement house. So he immediately found Moses Sawyer, a fellow student and painter, and the two were sort of best friends, so much so that Moses sort of absorbed Chaim Gross into his family, and they were friends for the rest of their lives. So these photos are both from 1922. They're from our archives. And so you see on the left, Moses and Chaim, and then on the right, a group of students, which include Peter Bloom, Leo Jackinson, and also the instructor, Abo Ostrowski, who's known for his printmaking. Jackinson, who is shown in the lower left of this photo, is quite interesting because he is actually the first person who suggested to Gross that he should try sculpture because he drew in a very three-dimensional way. So unfortunately, Jackinson died very young in a very tragic sort of circumstances, but he left this really important mark on Gross's life, and Gross always acknowledged that. So in addition to studying at the Educational Alliance, Gross also studied with two well-known sculptors, Elie Nodelman at the Beaux-Arts Institute of Design and Robert Laurent at the Art Students League. Nodelman taught Gross how to model, whereas Laurent taught Gross how to carve in wood. So that's how he learned how to become a direct carver. So the example on the right of Robert Laurent's Bather is a really spectacular example of carving in alabaster. So in Laurent's classes, Gross started by first making relief panels and then working in the round. So that transition was a method that he used with his students as well, which is you learn how to use the tools when you transition a drawing to a flat relief, and then you move to working in the round. It makes it a little bit easier to transition. On the left is a sculpture called Young Girl. This was done in the class with Laurent in 1926. And on the right is Two Acrobats, which was carved in 1927. And you'll notice that there's a lot of recurring themes throughout Gross's work, and one of those is acrobats, and sometimes acrobats or dancers, other kinds of performers. He called acrobats geniuses, and he really liked how he could play with the stacking of figures, because a lot of times when you're working with wood, you're working with a long column. So working with figures that kind of sit on top of one another really amplifies the sort of natural shape of the column of wood. Both of these are carved in lignum vitae, which I'll talk about in a minute, but was Gross's favorite kind of wood. So New York City in the early 20th century was really this important locus for manufacturing. There were many furniture makers still and in Manhattan, and these fine tropical hardwoods were shipped to New York and sold at lumber yards throughout the city. So this 1938 photo shows Gross choosing logs with a man named Monteith Dayton. He was one of the people who was in the sort of the family business at Monteith Lumber, which was one of Gross's favorite lumber yards. His other favorite was called Ichabod Williams. So when Gross was going to these lumber yards, he was seen as somewhat revolutionary at that time period because these tropical hardwoods were not used for fine art. The wood is incredibly dense. You have to sharpen your tools constantly. And that favorite wood, lignum vitae, is known for sinking if you were to throw it into water. So that's how dense and heavy it is. Also, a lot of these woods have remarkable changes in color and grain. They're very beautiful. And Gross also liked that there was creative limitations in a lot of the blocks and pieces sold. So for example, with a very flat board that was meant for a tabletop, he could make a beautiful relief, but then also simultaneously work in the round. Basically gave him an opportunity for compression in one direction and elongation in another. He did not glue or assemble pieces together, but instead used an entire block of wood. And most of these woods were imported from Central America, the Caribbean, South America, and also Africa. So these are coming from all over the world right into New York. So this is one of Chaim Gross's very early key works done in 1931. And this is actually not a tropical hardwood. This is done in Circassian walnut, so walnut that is sourced from the Caucasus. So once again, quite far-flung. It's traveled from Europe over to the US. And this photo is by Arnold Newman, who is an incredibly close friend of the Grosses. And it might be, I'm not sure how apparent it is from where you're sitting or if you're at home, how well you can see the screen, but there's a lot of texture on the surface of this sculpture. And one of the important aspects of direct carving is that you're honoring not only the material, but also the hand of the artist, that it's very, very apparent how something is made. He's also flipped the log to be horizontal, and the base that it's resting on is actually part of the same block of wood. So that's, once again, very, very technically difficult to do to get that balance just right. And somewhat like the acrobatics and dancers you see throughout his work, you'll see mothers and children repeated throughout his oeuvre. Here's another example of Gross's early work. This one's done in 1937. It's called Mother and Child at Play, carved in Palo Blanco, now in the Newark Museum's collection. I like to point this one out. Once again, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it, but there's a little bit of change in how the two faces are oriented. One's leaning a little bit to the left and one's to the right. And that sort of change in direction is part of what Gross liked to do in his sculpture. There's always a spiral line, as he describes it. So there's always movement, even in something that looks quite heavy and dense because of the material. He's always trying to get an upward movement in the work. And we have these amazing photos in our archives of Chaim Gross working in this studio on 9th Street. And what's really remarkable about this space is that not only do you see a lot of his own work, but you also see the work of other artists on the wall behind him. So if I use my cursor, I don't know if you can see this, there. So we've got paintings by Raphael Sawyer right here, David Berliuk here, John Graham here, and also a medieval wood carving right here. And then it's sort of hidden, but right behind the self-portrait, there is a lithograph by Yasuo Kuniyoshi. So most of these works are all still in the Foundation's collection today, and I think it's really important to understand that he liked to be surrounded by the works of his friends, and he found that very inspiring, but also kind of comforting to have the friends' works surrounding him. In addition to collecting the works of his contemporaries and fellow artists in New York, Gross also collected works from Africa. So this started in the late 1920s, and he was encouraged originally by the artist John Graham. I had mentioned one of the paintings was by him in the previous slide. But Graham was this really important connector figure of that period of time. He influenced a lot of other artists, specifically a lot of the abstract expressionist artists. But in terms of the relationship with Chaim Gross, he really encouraged this deep understanding of African arts. So Gross collected from a variety of sources, a lot of galleries, auction houses in New York. He did purchase some things when traveling, but mostly in Europe. He did go to Africa in the 1960s with his wife Renee, but they really didn't purchase much while they were there. So Gross definitely sort of absorbed a lot of the lessons of the carvings he was collecting from different places in Africa, and you see that clearly in some of his works, some a little bit less so. If you would have asked him if it was an influence, he would have said, maybe not, but I do have a deep affinity with the carvers of these works. So I think that we can see a little bit of that connection in this work here. This is called the Lindberg Family. It's carved in 1932, so right at the point that there's this big media sensation about the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., who was a toddler at the time. And so Gross makes this as a very quick response to something that's happening in the news. And the sculpture is totemic, so it's pieces stacked one on top of the other, very columnar, following the block of wood, and then also its narrative. So at the top, there's a little baby figure, and then about a third of the way down, right near Gross's elbow, you see these two kind of oval shapes. Those are depicting Charles Lindbergh Sr. and his wife. So a lot of Gross's works were more universal in theme, but he did make a number of pieces that were responsive to contemporary events. So he had his first solo show in 1932, so the same year, and this was at Gallery 144, which unfortunately was a rather short-lived gallery. But he showed 30 wood carvings and 1 stone sculpture, which was quite well received. And he did get a lovely introduction by the sculptor William Zorak, who described Gross's work as spirited, youthful, and alive. The exhibition really advanced Gross's work, his notoriety, and it really emphasizes the truth to materials idea, which is part of direct carving, the idea that the material's properties are readily apparent in the final sculpture. So in 1929, Gross met Renee Chaim, but they didn't get married until 1932. A lot of that had to do with Gross's finances not being, what her parents would have liked to see. She was born in 1909 in what was then the Russian Empire and is now Lithuania. She also immigrated to the U.S. in 1921, just like Chaim Gross, but she came with 3 generations of her family, so they were much better off, and they actually had a grocery store in Brooklyn. So they got married, once again, in 1932, so this year, 1932, is really, really key for Chaim Gross. And she not only acted as a model and muse for Chaim, but also really was very important in managing his later career. And they had 2 children, son Yudi and daughter Mimi, who's also a visual artist, still working today. And you can see them in the photo on the right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of Gross's New Deal projects, because I think they're really key to kind of understanding how important the New Deal was for artists of the time, how it really allowed them to survive a very difficult period. So actually, one of the memories that Renee talks about in one of her oral histories is the fact that she doesn't think that they would have survived the Great Depression without these commissions. So one work here is the Riveters, which is on the exterior of the Federal Trade Commission building in Washington, D.C. So this is visible if you're walking down the street, and this was completed in 1939. And the photo is by Elliot Eisen, who is an amazing photographer. We have a number of his works in the archive, and I will mention him a little bit later in his photography of Gross working. And then also, this panel was done as part of a series showing different sort of works that were done sort of in the Federal Trade Commission, but then also there was another panel that was done by Gross's teacher, Robert Laurent, which I find really interesting, that there were all these other connections. And the artistic sort of pool of people was a lot smaller then, so a lot of them knew one another. He also completed several projects for the 1939 and 1940 World's Fair in New York. So this is the Monumental Plaster, the Harvesters, which was placed on the exterior of the France Overseas building. So believe it or not, all these works that were made for this World's Fair were actually destroyed at the end. So we only have the photos. We don't have anything remaining from this, monumental piece of work. And quite interesting in terms of understanding direct carving was this 4-month project that Gross did at the World's Fair. Which was, he did a live carving demonstration where he went out to Queens every single day and would work on this sculpture in front of people as they were coming through the fair. So we have a newspaper clipping in our archive from that period of time, and it records the fact that people were heckling Gross and commenting that the figure was not realistic, to which he had many kind of pithy comments. But this was in 1940, so it's interesting that there's still so much resistance against abstraction of the figure even at that time. And the finished sculpture is on view at the Brooklyn Museum, so you can go ahead and visit it. It's carved in Imbuya wood. And Gross, because his work was so physical and made such beautiful photographs, there were also a lot of painters who wanted to capture this work as well. So on the left, I have Milton Avery's portrait of Gross from 1944. And on the right is Raphael Sawyer, twin of Moses Sawyer's, portrait of Gross working from 1929. So that was in Gross's first studio, and the sculpture that he's working on is still in our collection, so you can visit it today. And both of these paintings are on view in our space. Once again, I mentioned all these photographers because Gross was really surrounded by artists working in all different media. And Elliot Eisen was a longtime Life magazine photographer. He traveled all over the globe very extensively for his work, but he did a number of projects where he documented Gross working. And so one of these big projects that he did was showing Gross making this sculpture, Acrobats Balancing, in 1938. And all of these photos became the basis for the illustration of Gross's process in the book, The Technique of Wood Sculpture. So here I'm showing a charcoal sculpture study for Acrobats Balancing paired with the final work as it is seen today at the foundation. So this is so you can see it in color and you can appreciate all the changes in grain, color of the wood. That's all natural to that block of wood, which is lignum vitae. So in lignum vitae, and this is true in a lot of tropical hardwoods, there's a very dark color where you have the heartwood, and then as it transitions outward to the sapwood, it's much lighter. So in this case, it becomes sort of a blonde, maybe like a caramel color, and then the heartwood is almost like a chocolate brown. So Gross was, a big fan of that, so he would always emphasize it in his way of carving, and he wanted to really amplify that in the finished work. He also, as I mentioned before, drew constantly, so sometimes as preparation and other times after he completed a sculpture to kind of refine the forms. And he might return to the same idea repeatedly. So he also was doing it kind of to prepare for the future. All this knowledge that he had amassed about wood and wood sculpture was sort of realized in this 1957 publication called The Technique of Wood Sculpture, which can be found at most bookstores, used bookstores today. So I highly recommend, if you want to read it, please go seek out a copy. He talks a lot about methods, materials. He talks about his own background, which is one of the few places in which he actually does give any autobiography at all. And he also creates an entire appendix where he describes the properties of different kinds of woods that would be appropriate for making this kind of sculpture. It's really interesting to see what was commercially available at that period of time because the vast majority of these woods are no longer available on the market due to overforestation, and they're very heavily restricted. So Gross also delves into a lot of examples of what he considers to be the best wood sculpture from across the globe and far into the past. So he has examples from ancient Egypt, historic African figures, Northwest Coast Native American works, medieval Christian saints, and also Chinese polychromed figures. So he didn't collect all of these works himself, but these are ones that he used as reference or to just kind of find inspiration. So the range kind of underlines to me his insistence that wood carving is an incredibly ancient tradition, something that he grew up with living in the woods. It was very common for people to be whittling, but also that his take on wood carving where you're creating fine art as opposed to applied art or craft, to be a little bit of a modern reworking. And especially given the fact that he's using woods that weren't traditionally used, is quite interesting. So in these pages that I'm showing here, this is just one example. We've got a Haida totem pole paired with an American folk art rooster from MoMA's collection, or used to be in MoMA's collection. And then on the opposite side, we've got 3 pieces of African art. The bottom right one is a Nikbaka figure that was actually in the Gross's collection at that time. So he was using some of the pieces he owned himself as examples. And although he rarely cited inspirations specifically when he was asked, he does credit the many carvers whose work was seen at the time through this kind of anthropological or ethnographical lens. He really wants to highlight these works. And one of these really wonderful quotes from him in this book, which is one of the reasons why I do recommend reading it if you're interested, is he says, "I like wood. I like to carve it and to judge how the work is going by feeling the carved surface. There is a satisfaction and pleasure in the sense of touch that establishes an immediate affinity with the wood. It is also a primary reason why I never use power-driven tools at any stage of carving. The use of my hands and the customary hand tools maintains the close contact with the wood I enjoy." And he repeatedly talks about touch in his work, which is one of the reasons why we do have an access program that we run twice monthly that is specifically for people who are low vision or blind, but uses touch of objects in the collection. So now I'm going to play a very brief snippet from a longer film. And this is called Tree Trunk to Head. It was done in 1938, directed by Louis Jacobs, and its full length is 27 minutes. It's silent, black and white, and was done on 16 millimeter. You can view the full film on our website or on our Vimeo page. And this was shot at Gross's 93 East 9th Street studio, where he worked from 1930 until 1953. So here he is sketching from Renee, so you get to see what she looked like in motion, as well as Chaim Gross. And the block of wood that he's looking at here is called sabaku wood. So this is another tropical hardwood usually found in the Caribbean. And he's taking that frontal image of her, that sketch, and he's transitioning it to the block. Now, what I find interesting about this is how he then does the profile image, even though he hasn't actually drawn that on the paper. He just does that, maybe from looking at her, maybe from just his own vision that he has in his head. It's a little unclear. But you get to see his tools, how he's working, and once again, this is something that if you're interested in, I highly recommend it because, the entire film goes into much more detail. And here you can also see some of the paintings that he has on the wall behind. And because he was an educator, Gross used this film quite often when he was teaching people about direct carving or he was doing presentations. He would frequently just show the entire film so that people could get a sense of it and then do sort of a Q&A afterwards. And that's the final work, Head of Renee, which is on view at the foundation. Perfect. Okay, now I just want to show a few stills from the film just to reiterate what I was saying and just kind of talk through the steps. So at this point, he's already kind of hefted the block, he's looked at it, he's done a sketch on paper, and now he's using chalk to sketch out where he wants the shape to be in the sort of the finished work. But you can see he's taking off a certain amount on the sort of exterior of the block, but for the most part, he's trying to retain as much of the wood as possible, which is something that he really strongly believed in, is that you should try to use as much of the block as possible. And then you see him here using a gouge and a mallet. So a gouge is essentially a chisel that has a sort of rounded shape as opposed to being flat. So it's much more precise, and it takes out a much larger chunk of wood at a time. And then in his right hand, he's holding a mallet, which kind of functions a little bit like a hammer and basically pushes, the gouge through the wood. And then here, this is probably better seen on the film clip. This is a little bit blurry in the still, but this is him using a rasp, which is an abrader, to smooth the surfaces. And what's interesting about this is that he didn't always use the rasp on the entire surface. Sometimes he would leave the gouge marks very purposefully, but in this particular sculpture, he really removes all of those peaks and valleys caused by the gouge. And then finally, in terms of like the removal of material, we have him scraping the surface. So this is a little steel scraper, very thin piece of steel, about the size of a credit card. And then he also talked about how you could use like a piece of glass as well. And this is just something that you would scrape along the surface and remove any bumps or any roughness, kind of the way you would do maybe sandpaper, but he preferred this method. And then once you're finished, you go into the sealing of the wood, which is a multi-step process. And the first is a French finish, which is a mixture of white shellac, mineral spirits, and a little bit of olive oil. So he would paint the entire sculpture with the French finish, let it soak in, and then buff it with steel wool. If it was a softer wood, he might do a second, maybe even a third coat to ensure that it was sealed. And then finally, he would use a wax, usually a floor wax, and buff the surface until it was very shiny and the grain was really, really apparent. And on the right, you can see how Chaim Gross is comparing his portrait of Renee with the over life-size version of her that he's just completed. So a lot of these tools and materials are still in existence and can be seen at the foundation. This is in our studio space. And believe it or not, the piece that he was working on before he died is still visible in this photo, and the it's had the chiseling and then the rasp worked onto it. So it's in that bottom right corner in the vise. So it's not complete, but it's a really kind of very special sort of relationship that we can have these very personal elements of Gross's work on view. And here we can see Gross seated in the studio in around 1980. And this was a purpose-designed sort of space. He and wife Renee bought the building in 1962, and they wanted to create a studio space that was double height, so they dropped the floors down into the basement, and then added this really incredible skylight, which really still looks quite similar to how it did when Gross was living there. So he worked with two architects named Arthur Malson and Don Ryman on the renovation of the building in the 60s, and this was the design that he and they sort of came up with together. And we're really thankful that the skylight is as bright as it is today, and that was really due to a large project in 2018 where we completely restored it with support from the New York Landmarks Conservancy and the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. So the foundation is definitely the best place to see Chaim Gross's work if you're curious and you want to see it in great depth. However, there are other places in New York City, for those who are joining me live in the New York Studio School space, that you can see his work. So I mentioned previously the ballerina at Brooklyn Museum, but there's also East Side Girls. So this is a sculpture on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. and she is a 1928 flapper carved in lignum vitae. And this is another one where you can see a little bit of that spiral line that Gross really liked to show off. So her right foot is kind of stepping a little bit off the base, like her toe is a little bit over, and then her head is turned to the left as if she's looking over her shoulder. And so you get a little bit of that movement. Also, this one has wonderful, wonderful surface texture. The base where she's standing on and also her little wrap have gouge marks, and then her dress, which is very, very form-fitting around her body, but then kind of flares out a little bit around the knee, is completely covered in rasp marks, so little parallel marks. So he's differentiating between her skin, which is smooth, and then the rasp marks, which is like the fabric of the dress on her. So it's really very, very beautiful and detailed, and I recommend spending some time visiting her. And if you're walking just a few blocks from here, you will also see in the West Village the Family. So this is in Bleecker Street Playground, and this is a great example of his bronze work. So this was originally cast in the 70s, but not installed in the park until actually after Gross died. So that was in 1991. And what's interesting about this is you can see stylistically radically different from the woods. And he described the difference as wood has to grow up, bronze can grow out. And he preferred one foundry, B.D. Mackey, which is still in business in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. So if anyone is looking for a good foundry and looking into bronze casting. So as I conclude today, I'm hoping there's a lot of questions, but I also want to emphasize that we would love to have you visit. You can visit our website, which is here. We do tours, which are about an hour long, Wednesdays through Saturdays. We ask that you do book in advance, and those are available every week from after Labor Day in September until the end of June. We also offer public programming, so lectures, panel discussions, film screenings, poetry readings, our access program, tactile transmissions. And we also have a second floor space where we do temporary exhibitions. That was actually a floor that the Grosses rented out when they lived there. I didn't have time to really go into the third floor collection today, but I hope that leaving that open-ended will encourage you to come visit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. It's such a fun place to visit. I am so grateful for you to giving me a tour in the summer, and I recommend everyone head down to LaGuardia Place. So we'll open up the floor to questions. Those in the room, please raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone to you. And those online, feel free to type them into the Q&A.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, I just have a quick question. It might be silly, but I'm just wondering, you've referred to the carving as direct carving, and what does that mean exactly?
That's a great question, and I apologize I didn't make that clear. So direct carving is pretty much any kind of carving in one sense, which is whenever you're carving, you're doing something subtractive. So you're starting with one block and you're working in. And the idea that is really important for Chaim Gross and other artists of his generation is that direct carving is supposed to be about truth to material. So it's not just about the physical act of carving, it's about this directness. So if you're working on a piece and there's a surprise in the wood, so for example, maybe a pocket of sand or something bad or something good, like a beautiful change in grain or color, that you have to change your plan as you're working. So there's a direct response to what you're doing, that you're developing and you're changing the plan as you're working. And that's one of the reasons why in that kind of method you're not doing preparatory models, because you can't predict what a natural material is going to be once you start working with it. That's a great question.
We have an online question which is asking, did Chaim document going to the museums of the city?
He didn't in great extent, except for the fact that we have an amazing library of books, and which includes a lot of exhibition catalogs. So galleries, museums. I will say that his daughter, Mimi Gross, who's an incredible artist in her own right, does remember going with her father to the Met almost every week. When she was a child. And apparently that was a practice that he had continued to do for a very long time. He also was a big fan of the Natural History Museum. So he spent a lot of time at those locations, but then also he was very much a Whitney Studio Club artist as well. So he would have been coming here as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question. Did Chaim go back to the Educational Alliance School and taught there or as well, or he just went to taught at different institutions?
That's a great question. He taught at a variety of institutions, but for the longest time at the Educational Alliance. So he taught for over 50 years at the Educational Alliance, starting in 1927. But he also taught at the Art Students League, kind of off and on. He taught for over 20 years at the New School for Social Research, and he also taught sort of intermittently at both Brooklyn Museum when they had art classes, and then Brooklyn College as well. So he was teaching at a variety of different places, and primarily sculpture.
And to build off of that, in our conversation before your talk, you were mentioning that it's not a tradition of wood carving that's really carried through in the last couple of decades, and I wonder if you have a theory as to why that might be, and if perhaps there might be a resurgence, a renewed interest in this practice.
I would love to see that. I think it's a challenge, at least for young artists working today, because it's very difficult to find a lot of the materials you need. So even though these woods that Chaim Gross was using have been overforested and you wouldn't get those anymore, even just finding any kind of hardwood is difficult. The most common sort of way that I hear people getting into direct carving today is through kind of almost like an apprenticeship, where a younger artist is kind of pairing with an older artist who works in that vein. But I would love to see more of a focus on it, and I hope that places like the foundation are inspiring to younger artists.
We have another online question. It's sort of two parts, so I'll ask the first part, and then we'll follow up with the second part. The first one, this audience member writes, I enjoy looking at the art collection and thinking about Gross's close ties to other artists. Were most of these works gifts from those artists, or works he purchased, or were they trades?
A combination of all of those. And we're very lucky that Chaim was very meticulous very early on in his life about saving materials. So this is a good lesson for any young artists out there. Start saving your records, and if you're in an exhibition, save a few copies of any sort of ephemera that comes out of it. So he started keeping a record very early on of not only all the works he made, but also works he was purchasing as well. And he would write notes about, if something was an exchange, a trade, or a gift. Also, another thing that I would recommend is if you are giving someone a piece of art, to write on the back who you're giving it to, because that also really helps add to the story. That's a really good question.
And then the second question is, can you comment on his portrait sculptures? Were they commissioned, or studies, or something he wanted to explore?
Both. So, for example, I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately. Let me just see if I have something here. So you can't really see any in this picture, but there's at least one portrait. So right here, this is a little alabaster portrait. So this is carved in stone, and this is of Hilda Castellan, who was a very remarkable woman who was married to the artist Federico Castellan, who's a surrealist artist. I recommend looking him up if you haven't heard of him. And this was done not really as a commission, but just kind of as a way of like acknowledging that close friendship that the Grosses had with the Castellans. But he did do portraits by commission as well, so it kind of is a case-by-case basis.
And I'm curious about, you mentioned the difference between bronze and his understanding of the difference between bronze and wood, and if you could talk a little bit about his work in stone. Is that a material he worked with throughout his whole career in various ways, and why some might be in stone and why some might be in wood?
Good question. So there's a few stone pieces in this photo, but not a lot, but I'll keep it on the screen. He did stone throughout his career. You see a lot of them kind of in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but really it was never something he did in a phase, which is a little bit different than bronzes, which he became really, really passionate about in the late 1950s. But stone, he just kind of mixes in throughout. And what he was really interested with stone, kind of like the wood, he wanted you to kind of feel the material, the natural shape, so a lot of times he'll leave rough edges. They usually are kind of like low and blocky is the best way to describe them. And a lot of times he was using very soft stones. So I mentioned the portrait of Hilda Castellan, which is an alabaster. Alabaster is an incredibly soft stone, and Gross really, really liked using alabaster. That was his favorite. He also liked stones that were a little bit unusual in terms of color or texture. So he didn't like, a pure white marble would have had no interest to him. He wanted like veins and color and something, that was really, really like personalized and really unique. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Sasha? Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that picture right there, is that his studio, which is now the location of the foundation? Because I checked the address. This is a couple blocks.
Yes, it's very close.
East 9th Street, yeah. It's like a 5-minute walk from here. So it's considered the West Village or East Village borderline, so.
Yes. Oh, so good question. I think I might have not mentioned this address exactly. So this is actually at 526 LaGuardia Place, but it's also a very short walk. So this, 526 LaGuardia Place. Yes, so it's right just south of the park. So if it was a nicer night, I would tell you to just walk over there right now, but I don't think you want to go out in this rain. But this was the building that they bought in 1962. It's 4 stories tall, and this is the ground floor, and this is actually the back of the building. So it's actually facing west, which normally an artist wouldn't look for, like a west-facing studio. They usually look for north light. But this actually, because of the buildings and the frosted glass, is actually a very even light. So it actually is very, very good for working in. And it is a very, very short walk from here. The other address that I mentioned, 63 East 9th Street, was his studio from 1930 until 1953. And he left it, and the only reason why he left in 1953 is because they were tearing the building down. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sasha. This was a real joy.
Oh, thank you, Kara.